This morning we're going to begin a new series called The Parables of Jesus, the stories and the truths they tell. Before we begin, I want to tell you a parallel story that happened to me and my wife almost exactly 20 years ago. In June, we will have been married 20 years, and when we went away on our honeymoon, I knew that I had left some sour grapes behind us. When my friends got married and my cousins got married, I grew up with 16 cousins, and as they got married, I was the one who really escalated things on their wedding day. I made sure that their car wasn't just decorated, it was destroyed. I made sure that when they got into their apartment weeks later, there was a smell. I made sure that they were discovering little lingering things that I had left for them, hidden in books, hidden in their VCR, hidden everywhere, because I wanted them to remember I had gotten into their apartment before they had gotten back. And so I warned my wife when we were engaged. When we get married, it's going to be terrible. They're all coming for us on our wedding day, and they did. We had a decoy car, and they did so many awful and disgusting things to the decoy car that her mother wouldn't speak to some of my friends for years. I'm not exaggerating. So when we had another car pull up and we got to drive away in a clean car, I saw the looks on their faces, and I knew when we got back from our honeymoon that we were in for it. When we got back, we had been on a 9-hour flight. I was very tired, very exhausted. And when we pulled up to our apartment that was waiting for us, my truck was on cinder blocks and my tires and wheels were nowhere to be found. I knew that was only an appetizer of what was to come. I was exhausted, and my wife began to tell me, chill out, because she knew how I was going to be. And that's when I saw them in the bushes with their cameras, because this was around the era of punk, to those of you who are as old as me, and they wanted to get it on camera. And I will say, them being there on camera helped, because I was not going to give them the joy of me losing my cool. So I just collected myself, put my key in the lock that had been changed, asked them for a key. And I won't go into all the detail, but I will tell you this. Every flat surface in the apartment was covered with petroleum jelly. And then sprinkled with the finest, shiniest, tiniest, sparkliest, what's it called? Confetti you've ever seen. To the point, the landlord had to replace the flooring, because it's stained everywhere with this bright red. There were little star shapes of red everywhere that you looked. I don't remember what was in our bed, but it took hours to clean the bed, the sheets, you name it. I don't remember everything else, but it was rough. And for years, we would find little pieces of confetti. And we would smile, because these were our friends. Who had done this to us. And the point is this, their intent, now had they broken in? Kind of, they knew our landlord. Had they damaged some things? Sure, but their intent, I know it may not seem like it, was to bring joy. It was not to destroy. If they wanted to destroy, they could have destroyed my truck. They didn't. They showed me where the tires were. They helped me, but they were there to help put it all kind of back together. And so my point is this. They took a place that was supposed to be peace, shalom, and they sowed chaos into it. And their intent was to be funny, to be silly, and truly, I earned every bit of that. If you have time after the service, I will tell you of the things that me and my friends did to one another that to this day make our teenagers blush, and they're like, please don't attend my wedding. It's just, we're not going to get a wedding invitation, which means you don't get a wedding gift, so it kind of works for me, all right? But their point was not to destroy, it was actually to bring joy. One of my friends, we broke into his house and we put sticky notes on everything, and I had a sticky note with a little message to him and his wife in like every book on their bookshelf. It took me 3 hours. And he would tell me, like years later, he'd find a little note. It would remind him of when they got home, and that was the whole goal, to remind them of coming home as newlyweds. We're going to read a story that Jesus told where the intent was not to just insert a little chaos with a little bit of joy. It was to destroy. And Jesus is going to tell this parable on purpose to convey an important truth for us as the kingdom of God. So I want to share a few things as we get started. This is our first message in this series on parables. I want to tell you a little bit about parables as we get started. Number one, Jesus used parables to convey truth. Okay? His job was not just to tell silly stories. He didn't just tell you stories so that you'd remember them. It was so that you'd remember the parable and especially the truth that the parable brought. And his parables were usually about the kingdom. Now, this is very different from how we do things. When we want to convey truth, we don't typically use stories in the West. We follow the Roman and the Greek line of thinking, and we love ideas, specifically ideas based on words. But in the East, in the ancient Near East, in the Far East, and even the Middle East, they use stories. And even to this day, they typically will use a story to convey truth. And this was actually common in Jesus' day. There were plenty of records of the Hebrews sharing and telling parables. Second thing you got to know about parables is parables often left people puzzled or confused. When you read through Jesus' parables, you'll find often people walked away angry, they walked away upset, they walked away confused because he was actually being quite subversive. Jesus will even say sometimes, the reason I told a parable is because I didn't want everybody to know what I was saying. I only wanted those of you who believed to know what I was saying. The third thing you have to know about parables is that a parable goes beyond a fable or a myth. And this is really important because if you're not careful, you'll think of a parable kind of like a myth or kind of like a fable. And there's a real key difference, like Aesop's fables or fables in general. Fables always make light of or jest with a man's calamities. They mock them. Jesus does not do that. He never mocks man's calamities. Instead, he points to them as a need of redemption. Jesus also never presents talking trees or animals that reason together. He doesn't do that. His point is that this could be and probably was a real story. Sometimes this actually did happen, or we can think of people who this happened to. His stories, his parables are also not like myths. Myths have a tendency to present themselves as the truth or to elevate man. So like, think of a fable as mocking mankind. Sometimes myths, they elevate mankind. They turn into legends, and that's not his goal either. But a parable always separates itself cleanly from the truth. It's pointing you to a truth. And so parables reveal God's world illustrating God's word. This is important. Don't miss this, all right? If you miss this, you're going to miss everything Jesus says in a parable. To understand a parable, you have to believe that this world we live in is God's creation. And therefore, God has put into creation, into mankind, these parables, these ways of living, these truths that we see represented in nature, represented in a seed falling in the ground and dying to produce fruit, represented by the way that we feel when we lose something of value or someone that we value and love turns away from us and then comes back. And so parables simply reveal that God's world is an illustration of God's word. This really brings us back to the passage we read last week, Romans 1, verses 19 through 20. I think it's important we read it again. For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. Everything we need to know about God we can see. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power, divine nature, have been clearly perceived even since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. So now that we know some things about parables in general, I want to read to you what Jesus has to say about parables, about them himself in Matthew chapter 13, verses 10 through 13. This is actually the chapter we'll be in, so if you want to turn there, we'll read the second parable that Jesus shared. Matthew chapter 13, verses 10 through 13, Jesus says, or the disciples say first, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" They come to him in verse 10 of Matthew 13 and say, "Why do you speak to the people in parables?" Verse 11, and he answered them, "To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given." Verse 12, "For to the one who has come, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away." And this seems like injustice to us. We're like, that's not fair. And Jesus is emphasizing, when you come to me looking for truth, you will have more truth than you can probably handle. Verse 13, This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. Now, you're not going to like this next thing that I have to say, but it's important for you to understand. Jesus used parables to separate people, to cleanly separate in his audience who were there out of faith and who were not, who were seeking to be healed, who were just seeking a blessing, who were there because they believed in him as the Messiah, and who were not, who were looking for redemption and who were not. Jesus has a way of revealing the kingdom in such a way that it begins to separate people cleanly, because some have come seeking a Messiah who's only there to exterminate the Romans. They want him to be their oppressor in their name. And he's not interested in that. There are some who are only there to get something out of God, whether it be political power, a miracle, some money, the afterlife, and Jesus is not interested in that either. He wants to cleanly separate them. In Matthew chapter 13, verses 34 through 35, Jesus gives us even more about these parables. All these things Jesus said to the crowds in parables. Indeed, he said nothing to them without a parable. So here we find him speaking purely in parables. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter what has been hidden since the foundation of the world. Jesus' goal was to use these parables to point men to the truth that's been right in front of them the whole time. And that's precisely the type of parable we're going to read this morning. I'm going to begin with the second parable that Jesus shared because it is important to understand it as a parable that separates. It is in this passage we've just read in Matthew chapter 13 that we find him sharing this parable. It's one of the few parables where Jesus actually is going to give us an explanation of it himself. We don't have to wonder what this means or that means. And so in verse 24, I want to read to you the second parable that Jesus shares, but the first one in our series focused on the parables. Matthew 13, verse 24. He put another parable before them, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. Now, already, he's lost some of us. When you think of going to work tomorrow, you're probably not going to be sowing seed. We do not have many farmers in our church. But back then, most of them were very familiar with farming. If they didn't own a farm, they worked on a farm, or somebody in their family worked on a farm, or they had worked on a farm. Verse 25. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. This is not a prank. The intent here is to destroy. Now, I want you to think about how much effort the enemy has gone to. Now, there may be somebody you don't like. There may be somebody you even hate, though we are not to do that as Christians. But imagine somebody getting so under your skin, you go through the effort and the work and the turmoil of putting together a plan, going at night, and sowing this poisonous seed, these weeds among the wheat, and went away. Verse 26. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared also. Verse 27, and the servants of the master of the house came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have weeds? He said to them, an enemy has done this. So the servant said to him, then do you want us to go and gather them? But he said, no, lest gathering the weeds you root up the wheat along with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first, bind them in bundles to be burned. Gather the wheat into my barn. A couple of things you've got to notice in this first parable. I've already mentioned the first. That's the malicious intent of the enemy. His pure goal is to bring chaos and harm to the master. He spares no expense. He sows wherever there's good seed, these weeds. There's something you've got to know about these wheats and tares that they knew when he said it, but you may not be as familiar with this type of farming and how the wheat and the soil and the weeds work against each other and toward one another. Wheat has a pretty good root system, but it's not as dense and it's not as fortified and strong as darnel, which is more than likely the tare here. Darnel was a weed that looked very similar to wheat. And as a matter of fact, early on in the process of harvesting, you couldn't tell the difference. But when they were fully mature, you could tell the difference. And the darnel had a thick, hard, sturdy root system. So if you were to go out there and begin to pull this darnel before the wheat had fully matured, you would unearth the wheat too, and it would die. And so the master rightly says, we can't afford to pull up all the darnel. We can't afford to pull up all the tares. If we do that, we will damage not the soil, but the wheat next to it. The wheat is tender. And so we see the difference between the wheat and the tares, and ultimately we need to see the patience of this master who knows now is not the time to deal with it. But given time, these roots will produce fruit. And this fruit will reveal what needs to be bundled and burnt and what needs to be harvested and brought into my barn. As Jesus is sharing this parable, you can sense how uncomfortable everyone gets. To drive his point home with his disciples, he actually shares the word-for-word meaning that you probably are already familiar with. In Matthew chapter 13, verse 36, then he left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples came to him. Now, interesting. If anybody should assume they're the wheat, it's the disciples, right? But they're a little unnerved by this story. Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field. He answered, the one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. This is a term that Jesus used in reference to himself often. It's a prophetic term that we find in the Old Testament. It's a term that Jesus could use in such a way to point to his not only role as the Messiah, but also his divinity. The field is the world. That's the air we breathe, the world in which we live. The good seed is the sons of the kingdom. He's saying, that's you. If you're a believer, you are the good seed. The weeds are the sons of the evil one. And the enemy who sowed them is the devil. Now, this is important. Jesus is now going to begin a direct line of attack on Satan that he will not let up on in his ministry. In the Old Testament, there are some references to Satan, but it's far and few between. Jesus references Satan often. The kingdom is really putting a point on this. Jesus has come to address and attack the enemy who has been and is continuing to work against the peace that God offers. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels. Just as the weeds are gathered and burned with fire, so will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom. Notice this, all causes of sin and all lawbreakers, and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. This is a phrase that Jesus would use often for the separation from God, the eternal hell, damnation, the punishment of refusing and rejecting God. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. When we hear about hell, damnation, refusing or rejecting God, we tend to get very uncomfortable. I would remind you, the story of the gospel is that all men have a free will and a choice, and that hell and eternal separation from God was always created for Satan and the third of the angels that turned away from God. And that there is no man or woman eternally separated from God who did not willfully choose to reject him, to reject his gospel, to reject the light which lights every man in their heart, the portion of God they know. There is nobody there by accident. So a couple of takeaways from this parable, this second parable of Jesus, our first in this series. Number one, evil seed will produce evil fruit. Paul would say it this way, you can't sow what you don't expect to reap. Don't be surprised when you're reaping what you've sown. Now, the good news of the gospel is there is grace, there is mercy, and that's where this parable is slightly different, because nothing, no allegory, no metaphor, even parable holds up all the way through. And we're going to talk about the beautiful difference that the gospel makes in this case. But the first point that Jesus is making is that evil seed will produce evil fruit. It's as natural as the weeds in your garden. It's as natural as the plants that you're growing. My wife and I, we're trying to grow our garden again this year, and we've been watering it because we haven't had a lot of rain this year, and we know what's growing on each row, but she's out there very often digging and pulling out the weeds because the weeds will suffocate the good seed that we have sown. Evil seed will produce evil fruit. So my first question to us this morning is, where in your life have you allowed evil seeds to be planted? Where is there evil being produced? Now, the greater context here is this is not about your life. This is about the world. This is even about the church. The church will constantly have people who look like believers, act like believers, talk like believers, but when it comes right down to it, they cause sin and they break the law. And so the angels are tempted to say, Jesus, hey, let's go pull them out now. And God says, no, that would disrupt everything. Let me do that in my time. And that brings us to the second notion from this parable, and that is good seed will produce good fruit. This is true in your life. This is true in the church. This is true in the world. Where we invest good fruit, good seed, we produce good fruit. When you give of yourself, give of your time, give of your talent, give of your treasure to things that are good and righteous, I don't mean they just feel good. I mean they are good. They are what God calls good. The good news is that as God's light shines, the shadows deepen and they darken. And this is really where we begin to see the maturity of each. Once they plop through the ground a little bit, you can't tell. Give it a little bit of time, you can tell. This is why God encourages us to be patient, and Jesus even tells us to judge by fruit, not by sight, but by the fruit over the course of someone's life. Brothers and sisters, are there people in our church who are fake and phony? I'm sure there are. But over the course of years, we will be able to see good fruit and bad fruit. And we can trust God. And that's really the final encouragement from this parable. We can trust God to judge both good and evil. Now, the angels, they wanted to go in there and uproot. They wanted to go in there and tear it out. And if we're not careful, we do the same thing, don't we? I'm in here to find the phonies. Hey, guess what? There's some phony in me. There's some phony in you. All right? In this story, he says, the good seed are the sons of God. So if you are good seed, you are going out and producing good fruit. You are going out and sharing. What does he say? They're the messengers of the kingdom of God. The good seed, this good seed is the one who goes and shares the good news. The good seed is the sons of the kingdom. I want to be good seed in my life. And if we're not careful, we can get carried away where we think we're just supposed to be producing this fast and that fast. These people knew how long it took for seed to produce. You ought to be patient. You ought to watch as watering and sunlight produce good fruit. That's not to say there aren't hard days. That's not to say there aren't dry patches. There aren't the occasional discouragements. We can trust God to judge the good and the evil. And so Jesus says the master is super patient because he knows where this is all leading and where this is all going and what it leads to. Now, I mentioned to you earlier that I have some good news. The best news about this parable is that as Jesus tells it, he maps out for us that evil seed will produce evil fruit, good seed will produce good fruit, and you can trust God to judge both. Now, the good news of this parable is, this isn't, what I'm about to say is not true in nature. There's no way to make a weed into wheat. But in the kingdom of God, there is. I know story after story of people who came to church, thought they knew Christ, thought they were a believer, but only to realize 20 years in, 30 years in, I don't even know him. I've been a wheat among wheat this whole time. I've been subversively working against God. I didn't even know I had need of God. And so the gospel is, yes, sometimes we find ourselves in the kingdom, but not of the kingdom, and Jesus came to change that. Now, this is directly opposed to what the Hebrew understood the kingdom to be. What they understood the kingdom to be was, if you're a Hebrew, you're in. If you're not, you're out. And there's no grafting in. So when Paul talks about grafting yourself into this family tree, into the root of David, they found that off-putting. And this is the good news of the gospel. Jesus says, no, whereas you've understood it, that it's just keep everyone out, the gospel is we want as many in as possible. Even people that Satan was using against the kingdom. I don't know, like that guy Saul from Tarsus, who was a weed among weeds, working against the kingdom, putting Christians to death. But God appears to him, God saves him, and now he's wheat, he's producing good fruit, he's planting churches. And so the good news of the gospel is you can go from being a weed to good fruit, to good seed. Now, the Hebrews would find this destructive because they were all about protecting their brand, protecting their identity, protecting their race, protecting their culture. But the gospel was this radical idea that we could graft people in. And for the first 300 years, it worked really, really well. And here's why. There was persecution in the church. No one was just joining in because it's just something you did. But around 300 years in, it became popular in Roman culture because the emperor became a believer and said everybody has to be a Christian. And suddenly we were flooded with everybody who wasn't a believer but wanted to be a part of this thing. And so for the last 1,700 years, it has been more difficult to spot the weeds and the wheat unless you look over the long line of their life. But it's not so in all the world. I want to read to you the questions that are asked of a new believer in parts of China and Asia right now, before their church will baptize them. These are the questions they must answer. And I would admit to you, these are not questions that we often ask in the Church of the West. Number one, are you willing to leave home and lose the blessing of your Father? Today is week 3 of Life Track. I'll be in Life Track today, sharing with people who are joining our church what it means to be a part of our church. I don't really have to have that conversation with many people because joining our church doesn't mean they're going to lose the blessing of their Father. It does mean that in parts of the world today. Question number 2, are you willing to lose your job? Question number 3, are you willing to go to the village and to those who persecute you, forgive them and share the love of Christ with them? Question number 4, are you willing to give an offering to the Lord? Question number 5, are you willing to be beaten rather than deny your faith? Question number 6, are you willing to go to prison? Question number 7, you guessed it. Are you willing to die rather than deny Jesus? I would submit it's probably easier to spot the fakes and the phonies in the part of the world where it's hard to join the church because of outright persecution. But that's not where we live. You and I live in a society where, at best, you'll get made fun of online. Oh, no words. I know. When you're 15, they're scary. Grow up if you're here this morning and you're concerned about what your coworkers think about you. Some of you, grow up. You need to hear it. Your coworkers have dumb ideas about a million things. Our culture has the dumbest of ideas about all the things. I'll stand before God for what I am willing to deny or hold on to. And I'm telling you guys, we just need a generation of Christians who will say, think what you want. Laugh all you want. But that's easy to say when all they're going to do is laugh at us. Where Jesus is speaking, some of them would lose their life. So this parable, it almost seems inappropriate for the first 300 years of the Christian faith. Who would choose this? We're being marched into the Colosseum. I hope you're not a phony. But now in today's world, for most of the church, we see why this is such an appropriate parable. Because you can just come in, act a certain way. My goal this morning is not to talk you out of your faith or to talk you into convincing to convince you that your faith isn't real. My goal is for you to see what Jesus says about good seed and evil seed and how we can trust God with the difference. So I'd ask it again. Are you, as Jesus describes it, the sons of the kingdom, or are you all who cause sin and break the law, lawbreakers? The good news is Jesus wants to move you from one to the other. And once we are sons of the kingdom, he wants to move us into sowing seed, casting vision, sharing the gospel. When we see people in the worst of circumstances, we say, God is not finished. God has hope and purpose and even peace in the midst of what you're going through. And he wants to save you, redeem you, and change you, even when you don't feel like you can change yourself. This is the good news of the gospel. This is great news of a kingdom that Jesus will use many more parables to describe. Are you sowing good seed?